Introduction and Analysis, Section 4. The astronomy of Plato is based on the two principles of the same and the other, which God combined in the creation of the world. The soul, which is compounded of the same, the other, and the essence, is diffused from the centre to the circumference of the heavens. We speak of a soul of the universe, but more truly regarded, the universe of the Timaeus is a soul governed by mind, and holding in solution a residuum of matter or evil, which the author of the world is unable to expel, and of which Plato cannot tell us the origin. The creation, in Plato's sense, is really the creation of order, and the first step in giving order is the division of the heavens into an inner and outer circle of the other and the same, of the divisible and the indivisible, answering to the two spheres of the planets and of the world beyond them, all together moving around the earth, which is their centre. To us there is a difficulty in apprehending how that which is at rest can also be in motion, or that which is indivisible exist in space. But the whole description is so ideal and imaginative that we can hardly venture to attribute to many of Plato's words in the Timaeus any more meaning than to his mythical account of the heavens in the Republic and in the Phaedrus. Compare his denial of the blasphemous opinion that there are planets or wandering stars, all alike move in circles. Laws 7, 821-2. The stars are the habitation of the souls of men, from which they come and to which they return. In attributing to the fixed stars only the most perfect motion, that which is on the same spot or circling around the same, he might perhaps have said that to the spectator of all time and all existence, to borrow once more his own grand expression, or viewed in the language of Spinoza, sub specie aeternitas, they were still at rest, but appeared to move, in order to teach men the periods of time. Although absolutely in motion, they are relatively at rest, or we may conceive of them as resting, while the space in which they are contained, or the whole anima mundi, revolves. The universe revolves around a centre once in 24 hours, but the orbit of the fixed stars takes a different direction from those of the planets. The outer and inner sphere cross one another and meet again at a point opposite to that of their first contact, the first moving in a circle from left to right along the side of a parallelogram, which is supposed to be inscribed in it, the second also moving in a circle along the diagonal of the same parallelogram from right to left, or, in other words, the first describing the path of the equator, the second the path of the ecliptic. The motion of the second is controlled by the first, and hence the oblique line in which the planets are supposed to move becomes a spiral. The motion of the same is said to be undivided, whereas the inner motion is split into 7 unequal orbits, the intervals between them being in the ratio of 2 and 3, 3 of either the Sun moving in the opposite direction to Mercury and Venus, but with equal swiftness, the remaining 4, Moon, Saturn, Mars, Jupiter, with unequal swiftness to the former 3 and to one another. Thus arises the following progression: Moon 1, Sun 2, Venus 3, Mercury 4, Mars 8, Jupiter 9, Saturn 27. This series of numbers is the compound of the two Pythagorean ratios, having the same intervals, though not in the same order, as the mixture which was originally divided in forming the soul of the world. Plato was struck by the phenomenon of Mercury, Venus, and the Sun appearing to overtake and be overtaken by one another. The true reason of this, namely, that they lie within the circle of the earth's orbit, was unknown to him, and the reason which he gives, that the two former move in an opposite direction to the latter, is far from explaining the appearance of them in the heavens. All the planets, including the Sun, are carried round in the daily motion of the circle of the fixed stars, and they have a second or oblique motion which gives the explanation of the different lengths of the Sun's course in different parts of the earth. The fixed stars have also two movements, a forward movement in their orbit which is common to the whole circle, and a movement on the same spot around an axis, which Plato calls the movement of thought about the same. In this latter respect they are more perfect than the wandering stars, as Plato himself terms them in Timaeus, though in the Laws he condemns the appellation as blasphemous. The revolution of the world around earth, which is accomplished in a single day and night, is described as being the most perfect or intelligent. Yet Plato also speaks of an annus magnus, or cyclic year, in which periods wonderful for their complexity are found to coincide in a perfect number, i.e. a number which equals the sum of its factors, as 6 equals 1 plus 2 plus 3. This, although not literally contradictory, is in spirit irreconcilable with the perfect revolution of 24 hours. The same remark may be applied to the complexity of the appearance and occultations of the stars, which, if the outer heaven is supposed to be moving around the centre once in 24 hours, must be confined to the effects produced by the 7 planets. Plato seems to confuse the actual observation of the heavens with his desire to find in them mathematical perfection. The same spirit is carried yet further by him in the passage already quoted from the Laws, in which he affirms their wandering to be an appearance only, which a little knowledge of mathematics would enable men to correct. We have now to consider the much discussed question of the rotation or immobility of the earth. Plato's doctrine on this subject is contained in the following words: the earth, which is our nurse, compacted or revolving around the pole which is extended through the universe, he made to be the guardian and artificer of night and day, first and eldest of gods that are in the interior of heaven. 40 BC. There is an unfortunate doubt in this passage about the meaning of the word elomenen, which is translated either compacted or revolving, and is equally capable of both explanations. A doubt too may be raised as to whether the words artificer of day and night are consistent with the mere passive causation of them, caused by the immobility of the earth in the midst of the circling universe. We must admit further that Aristotle attributed to Plato the doctrine of the rotation of the earth on its axis. On the other hand, it has been urged that if the earth goes round with the outer heaven and sun in 24 hours, there is no way of accounting for the alternation of day and night, since the equal motion of the earth and sun would have the effect of absolute immobility. To which it may be replied that Plato never says that the earth goes round with the outer heaven and sun, although the whole question depends on the relation of earth and sun. Their movements are nowhere precisely described. But if we suppose with Mr. Grote that the diurnal rotation of the earth on its axis and the revolution of the sun and outer heaven precisely coincide, it would be difficult to imagine that Plato was unaware of the consequence. For though he was ignorant of many things which are familiar to us, and often confused in his ideas where we have become clear, we have no right to attribute to him a childish want of reasoning about very simple facts, or an inability to understand the necessary and obvious deductions from geometrical figures or movements. Of the causes of day and night, the pre-Socratic philosophers, and especially the Pythagoreans, gave varied accounts, and therefore the question can hardly be imagined to have escaped him. On the other hand, it may be urged that the further step, however simple and obvious, is just what Plato often seems to be ignorant of, and that as there is no limit to his insight, there is also no limit to the blindness which sometimes obscures his intelligence. Compare the construction of solids out of surfaces in his account of the creation of the world, or the attraction of similars to similars. Further, Mr. Grote supposes, not that elolamen means revolving, or that this is the sense in which Aristotle understood the word, but that the rotation of the earth is necessarily implied in its adherence to the cosmical axis. But alpha, if, as Mr. Grote assumes, Plato did not see the rotation of the earth on its axis and of the sun and outer heavens round the earth in equal times was inconsistent with the alternation of day and night, neither need we suppose that he would have seen that the immobility of the earth to be inconsistent with the rotation of the axis. And beta, what proof is there that the axis revolves at all? The comparison of the two passages quoted by Mr. Grote, see page 19 of his pamphlet on the rotation of the earth, from Aristotle de Cielo, Book 3, Chapter 13, and Neo Graphitico, and Chapter 14, Hemias Meson, clearly shows, although this is a matter of minor importance, that Aristotle, as Proclus and Simplicius supposed, understood illustheo in the Timaeus to mean revolving. For the second passage, in which the motion on an axis is expressly mentioned, refers to the first, but this would be unmeaning unless the estai in the first passage meant rotation on an axis. The immutability of the earth is more in accordance with Plato's other writing than the opposite hypothesis, for in the Phaedo the earth is described as the centre of the world, and is not said to be in motion. In the Republic the pilgrims appear to be looking out from the earth upon the motions of the heavenly bodies. In the Phaedo, Hestia, who remains immovable in the house of Zeus while the other gods go in procession, is called the first and eldest of the gods, and is probably the symbol of the earth. The silence of Plato in these and in some other passages, compare Laws X 893b, in which he might be expected to speak of the rotation of the earth, is more favourable to the doctrine of its immobility than to the opposite. If he had meant to say that the earth revolves on its axis, he would have said so in distinct words, and have explained the relation of its movements to those of other heavenly bodies. The meanings of the word artificer of day and night is literally true according to Plato's view, for the alternation of day and night is not produced by the motion of the heavens alone, or by the immobility of the earth alone, but by both together, and that which has the inherent force or energy to remain at rest while all other bodies are moving may be truly said to act equally with them. We should not lay too much stress on Aristotle or the writer Bekere having adopted the other interpretations of the words, although Alexander of Aphrodisias thinks that he could not have been ignorant either of the doctrine of Plato or of the sense which he intended to give to the word illomenon. For the citations of Plato and Aristotle are frequently misinterpreted by him, and he seems hardly ever to have had in his mind the connection in which they occur. In this case the illusion is very slight, and there is no reason to suppose that the diurnal revolution of the heavens was present to his mind. Hence we need not attribute to him the error from which we are defending Plato. After weighing once against another all these complicated probabilities, the final conclusion at which we arrive is that there is nearly as much to be said on one side of the question as on the other, and that we are not perfectly certain whether, as Bock and the majority of commentators ancient as well as modern are inclined to believe, Plato thought that the earth was at rest in the centre of the universe, or, as Aristotle and Mr. Grote suppose, that it revolved on its axis. Whether we assume the earth to be stationary in the centre of the universe, or to revolve with the heavens, no explanation is given of the variation in the length of days and nights at different times of the year. The relations of the earth and heavens are so indistinct in the Timaeus, and so figurative in the Phaedo, Phaedrus, and Republic, that we must give up any hope of ascertaining how they were imagined by Plato, if he had any fixed or scientific conception of them at all. End of section 4.
Timaeus by Plato, translated by Benjamin Jowett. Introduction and Analysis, section 5. The soul of the world is framed on the analogy of the soul of man, and many traces of anthropomorphism blend with Plato's highest flights of idealism. The heavenly bodies are endowed with thought. The principles of the same and other exist in the universe as well as in the human mind. The soul of man is made out of the remains of the elements which had been used in creating the soul of the world. These remains, however, are diluted to the third degree. By this Plato expresses the measure of the difference between the soul human and divine. The human soul, like the cosmical, is framed before the body, as the mind is before the soul of Aether. 30b. This is the order of the divine work, and the finer parts of the body, which are more akin to the soul, such as the spinal marrow, are prior to the bones and flesh. The brain, the containing vessel of the divine part of the soul, is nearly in the form of a globe, which is the image of the gods, who are the stars and of the universe. There is, however, an inconsistency in Plato's manner of conceiving the soul of man. He cannot get rid of the element of necessity which is allowed to enter. He does not, like Kant, attempt to vindicate for man a freedom out of space and time, but he acknowledges him to be subject to the influence of external causes, and leaves hardly any place for freedom of the will. The lusts of men are caused by their bodily constitution, 86c, though they may be increased by bad education and bad laws, which implies that they may be decreased by good education and good laws. He appears to have an inkling of the truth that to the higher nature of man evil is involuntary. This is mixed up with the view, which, while apparently agreeing with it, is in reality the opposite of it, that vice is due to physical causes. 86d. In the Timaeus as well as in the laws, he also regards vices and crimes as simply involuntary. They are diseases analogous to the diseases of the body and arising out of the same causes. If we draw together the opposite poles of Plato's system, we find that, like Spinoza, he combines idealism with fatalism. The soul of a man is divided by him into three parts, answering roughly to the charioteer and steeds of the Phaedrus, and to the logos, thumos, and epithumia of the Republic and Nicomachean Ethics. First, there is the immortal nature of which the brain is the seat, and which is akin to the soul of the universe. This alone thinks and knows, and is the ruler of the whole. Secondly, there is the higher mortal soul, which, though liable to perturbations of her own, takes the side of reason against the lower appetites. The seat of this is the heart, in which courage, anger, and all the nobler affections are supposed to reside. There the veins all meet. It is their centre or house of guard, whence they carry the orders of the thinking being to the extremities of his kingdom. There is also a third or appetitive soul, which receives the commands of the immortal part, not immediately but mediately, through the liver, which reflects on its surface the admonitions and threats of the reason. The liver is imagined by Plato to be a smooth and bright substance, having a store of sweetness and also of bitterness, which reason freely uses in the execution of her mandates. In this region, as ancient superstition told, were to be found intimations of the future. But Plato is careful to observe that although such knowledge is given to the inferior parts of man, it requires to be interpreted by the superior. Reason and not enthusiasm is the true guide of man. He is only inspired when he is demented by some distemper or possession. The ancient saying that only a man in his senses can judge his own actions is approved by modern philosophy too. The same irony which appears in Plato's remark that the men of old time must surely have known the gods who were their ancestors, and we should believe them as custom requires, is also manifest in his account of divination. The appetitive soul is seated in the belly, and there imprisoned like a wild beast, far away from the council chamber, as Plato graphically calls the head, in order that the animal passions may not interfere with the deliberations of reason. Though the soul is said by him to be prior to the body, yet we cannot help seeing that it is constructed on the model of the body, the threefold division into the rational, passionate, and appetitive, corresponding to the head, heart, and belly. The human soul differs from the soul of the world in this respect, that it is enveloped and finds its expression in matter, whereas the soul of the world is not only enveloped or diffused in matter, but is the element in which matter moves. The breath of man is within him, but the air or ether of heaven is the element which surrounds him and all things. Pleasure and pain are attributed in the Timaeus to the suddenness of our sensations, the first being a sudden restoration, the second a sudden violation of nature. Compare Philebus 31d. The sensations became conscious to us when they are exceptional. Sight is not attended either by pleasure or pain, but hunger and the appeasing of hunger are pleasant and painful, because they are extraordinary. End of section 5. Introduction and Analysis, section 6. I shall not attempt to connect the physiological speculations of Plato either with ancient or modern medicine. What light I can throw upon them will be derived from the comparison of them with his general system. There is no principle so apparent in the physics of the Timaeus, or in ancient physics generally, as that of continuity. The world is conceived of as a whole, and the elements are formed into and out of one another. The varieties of substances and processes are hardly known or noticed. And in a similar manner the human body is conceived of as a whole, and the different substances of which, to a superficial observer, it appears to be composed, the blood, flesh, sinews, like the elements out of which they are formed, are supposed to pass into one another in regular order, while the infinite complexity of the human frame remains unobserved. And diseases arise from the opposite process, when the natural proportions of the four elements are disturbed, and the secondary substances which are formed out of them, namely blood, flesh, sinews, are generated in an inverse order. Plato found heat and air within the human frame, and the blood circulating in every part. He assumes in language almost unintelligible to us that a network of fire and air envelopes the greater part of the body. This outer net contains two lesser nets, one corresponding to the stomach, the other to the lungs, and the entrance to the latter is forked, or divided into two passages, which lead to the nostrils and to the mouth. In the process of respiration, the external net is said to find a way in and out of the pores of the skin, while the interior of it and the lesser nets move alternately into each other. The whole description is figurative, as Plato himself implies, 79d, when he speaks of a fountain of fire which we compare to the network of a creel. He really means by this what we should describe as a state of heat or temperature in the interior of the body. The fountain of fire or heat is also in a figure the circulation of the blood. The passage is partly imagination, partly fact. He has a singular theory of respiration, for which he accounts solely by the movement of the air in and out of the body. He does not attribute any part of the process to the action of the body itself. The air has a double ingress and a double exit, through the mouth or nostrils, and through the skin. When exhaled through the mouth or nostrils, it leaves a vacuum which is filled up by other air, finding a way in through the pores, this air being thrust out of its place by the exhalation from the mouth and nostrils. There is also a corresponding process of inhalation through the mouth or nostrils, and of exhalation through the pores. The inhalation through the pores appears to take place nearly at the same time as the exhalation through the mouth, and conversely. The internal fire is in either case the propelling cause outwards, the inhaled air, when heated by it, having a natural tendency to move out of the body to the place of fire, while the impossibility of a vacuum is the propelling cause inwards. Thus we see that this singular theory is dependent on two principles largely employed by Plato in explaining the operations of nature, the impossibility of a vacuum and the attraction of like to like. To these there has to be added a third principle, which is the condition of the action of the other two, the interpenetration of particles in proportion to their density or rarity. It is this which enables fire and air to permeate the flesh. Plato's account of digestion and the circulation of the blood is closely connected with his theory of respiration. Digestion is supposed to be effected by the action of the internal fire, which in the process of respiration moves into the stomach and minces the food. As the fire returns to its place, it takes with it the minced food or blood, and in this way the veins are replenished. Plato does not inquire how the blood is separated from the faeces. Of the anatomy and functions of the body he knew very little, e.g., of the uses of the nerves in conveying motion and sensation, which he supposed to be communicated by the bones and veins. He was also ignorant of the distinction between veins and arteries. The latter term he applies to the vessels which conduct air from the mouth to the lungs. He supposes the lung to be hollow and bloodless. The spinal marrow he conceives to be the seed of generation. He confuses the parts of the body with the states of the body. The network of fire and air is spoken of as a bodily organ. He has absolutely no idea of the phenomena of respiration, which he attributes to a law of equalization in nature, the air which is breathed out displacing other air, which finds a way in. He is wholly unacquainted with the process of digestion. Except the general divisions into the spleen, the liver, the belly, and the lungs, and the obvious distinction of flesh, bones, and the limbs of the body, we find nothing that reminds us of anatomical facts. But we find much which is derived from his theory of the universe and transferred to man, as there is much also in his theory of the universe which is suggested by man. The microcosm of the human body is the lesser image of the macrocosm. The courses of the same and the other affect both. They are made of the same elements, and therefore in the same proportions. Both are intelligent natures, endued with the power of self-motion, and the same equipoise is maintained in both. The animal is a sort of world to the particles of the blood which circulate in it. All the four elements entered into the original composition of the human frame. The bone was formed out of smooth earth. Liquids of various kinds pass to and fro. The network of fire and air irrigates the veins. Infancy and childhood is the chaos or first turbid flux of sense prior to the establishment of order. The intervals of time which may be observed in some intermittent fevers correspond to the density of the elements. The spinal marrow, including the brain, is formed out of the finest sorts of triangles, and is the connecting link between body and mind. Health is only to be preserved by imitating the motions of the world in space, which is the mother and nurse of generation. The work of digestion is carried on by the superior sharpness of the triangles forming the substance of the human body to those which are introduced into it in the shape of food. The freshest and acutest forms of triangles are those that are found in children, but they become more obtuse with advancing years, and when they finally wear out and fall to pieces, old age and death supervene. As in the Republic, Plato is still the enemy of the purgative treatment of physicians, which, except in extreme cases, no man of sense will ever adopt. For, as he adds, with an insight into the truth, every disease is akin to the nature of the living being, and is only irritated by stimulants. He is of opinion that nature should be left to herself, and is inclined to think that physicians are in vain. Compare Laws 6, 761c, where he says that warm baths would be more beneficial to the limbs of the aged rustic than the prescriptions of a not overwise doctor. If he seems to be extreme in his condemnation of medicine, and to rely too much on diet and exercise, he might appeal to nearly all the best physicians of our own age in support of his opinions, who often speak to their patients of the worthlessness of drugs. For we ourselves are skeptical about medicine, and very unwilling to submit to the purgative treatment of physicians. May we not claim for Plato an anticipation of modern ideas, as about some questions of astronomy and physics, so also about medicine? As in the Charmides 156.7, he tells us that the body cannot be cured without the soul, so in the Timaeus he strongly asserts the sympathy of soul and body, and defect of either is the occasion of the greatest discord and disproportion in the other. Here too may be a presentiment that in the medicine of the future the interdependence of mind and body will be more fully recognized, and that the influence of the one over the other may be exerted in a manner which is not now thought possible. End of section 6. Introduction and Analysis, section 7. In Plato's explanation of sensation, we are struck by the fact that he has not the same distinct conception of organs of sense which is familiar to ourselves. The senses are not instruments but rather passages through which external objects strike upon the mind. The eye is the aperture through which the stream of vision passes. The ear is the aperture through which the vibrations of sound pass. But that the complex structure of the eye or the ear is in any sense the cause of sight and hearing, he seems hardly to be aware. The process of sight is the most complicated. Compare Republic 6, 507, 508, and consists of 3 elements: the light which is supposed to reside within the eye, the light of the sun, and the light emitted from external objects. When the light of the eye meets the light of the sun, and both together meet the light issuing from an external object, this is the simple act of sight. When the particles of light which proceed from the object are exactly equal to the particles of the visual ray which meets them from within, then the body is transparent. If they are larger and contract the visual ray, a black colour is produced; if they are smaller and dilated, a white. Other phenomena are produced by the variety and motion of light. A sudden flash of fire at once elicits light and moisture from the eye, and causes a bright colour. A more subdued light, on mingling with the moisture of the eye, produces red colour. Out of these elements all other colours are derived. All of them are combinations of bright and red with white and black. Plato himself tells us that he does not know in what proportions they combine, and he is of opinion that such knowledge is granted to the gods only. To have seen the affinity of them to each other and their connection with light is not a bad basis for a theory of colours. We must remember that they were not distinctly defined to his as they are to our eyes. He saw them, not as they are divided in the prism, or artificially manufactured for the painter's use, but as they exist in nature, blended and confused with one another. We can hardly agree with him when he tells us that smells do not admit of kinds. He seems to think that no definite qualities can attach to bodies which are in a state of transition or evaporation. He also makes the subtle observation that smells must be denser than air, though thinner than water, because when there is an obstruction to the breathing, air can penetrate but not smell. The affections peculiar to the tongue are of various kinds, and like many other affections are caused by contraction and dilation. Some of them are produced by rough, others by astringent, others by inflammatory substances. These act upon the testing instruments of the tongue, and produce a more or less disagreeable sensation, while other particles congenial to the tongue soften and harmonize them. The instruments of taste reach from the tongue to the heart. Plato has a lively sense of the manner in which sensation and motion are communicated from one part of the body to the other, though he confuses the affections with the organs. Hearing is a blow which passes through the ear and ends in the region of the liver, being transmitted by means of the air, the brain, and the blood to the soul. The swifter sound is acute, the sound which moves slowly is grave. A great body of sound is loud, the opposite is low. Discord is produced by the swifter and slower motions of two sounds, and is converted into harmony when the swifter motions begin to pause and are overtaken by the slower. The general phenomena of sensation are partly internal, but the more violent are caused by conflict with external objects. Proceeding by a method of superficial observation, Plato remarks that the more sensitive parts of the human frame are those which are least covered by flesh, as is in the case with the head and the elbows. Man, if his head had been covered with a thicker pulp of flesh, might have been a longer lived animal than he is, but could not have had as quick perceptions. On the other hand, the tongue is one of the most sensitive of organs, but then this is made not to be a covering to the bones, which contain the marrow or source of life, but with an express purpose, and in a separate mass. 75a. End of section 7.
Introduction and Analysis, Section 8, Part 1. Recording by Patti Cunningham. We have now to consider how far in any of these speculations Plato approximated to the discoveries of modern science. The modern physical philosopher is apt to dwell exclusively on the absurdities of ancient ideas about science, on the haphazard fancies and a priori assumptions of ancient teachers, on their confusion of facts and ideas, on their inconsistency and blindness to the most obvious phenomena. He measures them not by what preceded them, but by what has followed them. He does not consider that ancient physical philosophy was not a free inquiry, but a growth in which the mind was passive rather than active, and was incapable of resisting the impressions which flowed in upon it. He hardly allows to the notions of the ancients the merit of being the stepping stones by which he has himself risen to a higher knowledge. He never reflects how great a thing it was to have formed a conception, however imperfect, either of the human frame as a whole or of the world as a whole. According to the view taken in these volumes, the errors of ancient physicists were not separable from the intellectual conditions under which they lived. Their genius was their own, and they were not the rash and hasty generalizers which since the days of Bacon we have been apt to suppose them. The thoughts of men widen to receive experience. At first they seem to know all things as in a dream. After a while they look at them closely and hold them in their hands. They began to arrange them in classes and to connect causes with effects. General notions are necessary to the apprehension of particular facts, the metaphysical to the physical. Before men can observe the world, they must be able to conceive it. To do justice to the subject, we should consider the physical philosophy of the ancients as a whole. We should remember, 1, that the nebular theory was the received belief of several of the early physicists, 2, that the development of animals out of fishes who came to land, and of man out of animals, was held by Anaximander in the 6th century before Christ. Compare Plutarch, Symposiax 8, question 8. 4. De Placitas Philosophorum v. 19:1. 3. That even by Philolaus and the early Pythagoreans, the earth was held to be a body like the other stars revolving in space around the sun or a central fire. 4. That the beginnings of chemistry are discernible in the similar particles of Anaxagoras. Also, they knew or thought, 5. That there was a sex in planets as well as in animals. 6. They were aware that musical notes depended on the relative length or tension of the strings from which they were emitted, and were measured by ratios of number. 7. that mathematical laws pervaded the world, and even qualitative differences were supposed to have their origin in number and figure. 8. The annihilation of matter was denied by several of them, and the seeming disappearance of it held to be a transformation only. For although one of these discoveries might have been supposed to be a happy guess, taken together they seem to imply a great advance and almost maturity of natural knowledge. We should also remember, when we attribute to the ancients hasty generalizations and delusions of language, that physical philosophy and metaphysical too have been guilty of similar fallacies in quite recent times. We by no means distinguish clearly between mind and body, between ideas and facts. Have not many discussions arisen about the atomic theory in which a point has been confused with a material atom? Have not the natures of things been explained by imaginary entities, such as life or phlogiston, which exist in the mind only? Has not disease been regarded, like sin, sometimes as a negative and necessary, sometimes as a positive or malignant principle? The idols of Bacon are nearly as common now as ever. They are inherent in the human mind, and when they have the most complete dominion over us, we are least able to perceive them. We recognize them in the ancients, but we fail to see them in ourselves. Such reflections, although this is not the place in which to dwell upon them at length, lead us to take a favorable view of the speculations of the Timaeus. We should consider not how much Plato actually knew, but how far he has contributed to the general ideas of physics, or supplied the notions which, whether true or false, have stimulated the minds of later generations in the path of discovery. Some of them may seem old-fashioned, but may nevertheless have had a great influence in promoting system and assisting inquiry, while in others we hear the latest word of physical or metaphysical philosophy. There is also an intermediate class, in which Plato falls short of the truths of modern science, though he is not wholly unacquainted with them. 1. To the first class belongs the teleological theory of creation. Whether all things in the world can be explained as a result of natural laws, or whether we must not admit of tendencies and marks of design also, has been a question much disputed of late years. Even if all phenomena are the result of natural forces, we must admit that there are many things in heaven and earth which are as well expressed under the image of mind or design as under any other. At any rate, the language of Plato has been the language of natural theology down to our own time, nor can any description of the world wholly dispense with it. The notion of first and second, or cooperative causes, which originally appears in the Timaeus, has likewise survived to our own day, and has been a great peacemaker between theology and science. Plato also approaches very near to our doctrine of the primary and secondary qualities of matter. 61 ff. 2. Another popular notion which is found in the Timaeus is the feebleness of the human intellect. God knows the original qualities of things. Man can only hope to attain to probability. We speak in almost the same words of human intelligence, but not in the same manner of the uncertainty of our knowledge of nature. The reason is that the latter is assured to us by experiment, and is not contrasted with the certainty of ideal or mathematical knowledge. But the ancient philosopher never experimented. In the Timaeus, Plato seems to have thought that there would be impiety in making the attempt. He, for example, who tried experiments in colors, would forget the difference of the human and divine natures. 68d. Their indefiniteness is probably the reason why he singles them out as especially incapable of being tested by experiment. Compare the saying of Anaxagoras, Sextus, Outlines of Pyrrhonism, I. 33, that since snow is made of water, and water is black, snow ought to be black. The greatest divination of the ancients was the supremacy which they assigned to mathematics in all the realms of nature, for in all of them there is a foundation of mechanics. Even physiology partakes of figure and number, and Plato is not wrong in attributing them to the human frame, but in the omission to observe how little could be explained by them. Thus we may remark in passing that the most fanciful of ancient philosophies is also the most nearly verified in fact. The fortunate guess that the world is a sum of numbers and figures has been the most fruitful of anticipations. The diatonic scale of the Pythagoreans and Plato suggested to Kepler that the secret of the distances of the planets from one another was to be found in mathematical proportions. The doctrine that the heavenly bodies all move in a circle is known by us to be erroneous, but without such an error, how could the human mind have comprehended the heavens? Astronomy, even in modern times, has made far greater progress by the high a priori road than could have been attained by any other. Yet strictly speaking, and the remark applies to ancient physics generally, this high a priori road was based upon a posteriori grounds, for there were no facts of which the ancients were so well assured by experience as facts of number. Having observed that they held good in a few instances, they applied them everywhere, and in the complexity of which they were capable, found the explanation of the equally complex phenomena of the universe. They seemed to see them in the least things as well as in the greatest, in atoms as well as in suns and stars, in the human body as well as in external nature. And now a favorite speculation of modern chemistry is the explanation of qualitative difference by quantitative, which is at present verified to a certain extent, and may hereafter be of far more universal application. What is this but the atoms of Democritus and the triangles of Plato? The ancients should not be wholly deprived of the credit of their guesses because they were unable to prove them. May they not have had, like the animals, an instinct of something more than they knew? Besides general notions, we seem to find in the Timaeus some more precise approximations to the discoveries of modern physical science. First, the doctrine of equipoise. Plato affirms, almost in so many words, that nature abhors a vacuum. Whenever a particle is displaced, the rest push and thrust one another until equality is restored. We must remember that these ideas were not derived from any definite experiment, but were the original reflections of man, fresh from the first observations of nature. The latest word of modern philosophy is continuity and development, but to Plato this is the beginning and foundation of science. There is nothing that he is so strongly persuaded of as that the world is one, and that all the various existences which are contained in it are only the transformations of the same soul of the world acting on the same matter. He would have readily admitted that out of the protoplasm all things were formed by the gradual process of creation, but he would have insisted that mind and intelligence, not meaning by this, however, a conscious mind or person, were prior to them and could alone have created them. Into the workings of this eternal mind or intelligence he does not enter further, nor would there have been any use in attempting to investigate the things which no eye has seen nor any human language can express. Lastly, there remain 2 points in which he seems to touch great discoveries of modern times: the law of gravitation and the circulation of the blood. 1. The law of gravitation, according to Plato, is a law, not only of the attraction of lesser bodies to larger ones, but of similar bodies to similar, having a magnetic power as well as a principle of gravitation. He observed that the earth, water, and air had settled down to their places, and he imagined fire, or the exterior ether, to have a place beyond air. When air seemed to go upwards and fire to pierce through air, when water and earth fell downward, they were seeking their native elements. He did not remark that his own explanation did not suit all phenomena, and the simpler explanation, which assigns to bodies degrees of heaviness and lightness proportioned to a mass and distance of the bodies which attract them, never occurred to him. Yet the affinities of similar substances have some effect upon the composition of the world, and of this Plato may be thought to have had an anticipation. He may be described as confusing the attraction of gravitation with the attraction of cohesion. The influence of such affinities and the chemical action of one body upon another in long periods of time have become a recognized principle of geology. 2. Plato is perfectly aware, and he could hardly be ignorant, that blood is a fluid in constant motion. He also knew that blood is partly a solid substance consisting of several elements, which, as he might have observed in the use of cupping glasses, 79e, decompose and die when no longer in motion. But the specific discovery that the blood flows out on one side of the heart through the arteries and returns through the veins on the other, which is commonly called the circulation of the blood, was absolutely unknown to him. End of section 8, part 1. Recording by Patti Cunningham. Introduction and Analysis, Section 8, Part 2. Recording by Patti Cunningham. A further study of the Timaeus suggests some afterthoughts which may be conveniently brought together in this place. The topics which I propose briefly to reconsider are a. The relation of the Timaeus to the other dialogues of Plato and to the previous philosophy, b. The nature of God and of creation, c. The morality of the Timaeus. A. The Timaeus is more imaginative and less scientific than any other of the Platonic dialogues. It is conjectural astronomy, conjectural natural philosophy, conjectural medicine. The writer himself is constantly repeating that he is speaking what is probable only. The dialogue is put into the mouth of Timaeus, a Pythagorean philosopher, and therefore here, as in the Parmenides, we are in doubt how far Plato is expressing his own sentiments. Hence the connection with the other dialogues is comparatively slight. We may fill up the lacunae of the Timaeus by the help of the Republic or Phaedrus. We may identify the same and other with the Paras and Apeiron of the Philebus. We may find in the Laws or in the Statesman parallels with the account of creation and of the first origin of man. It would be possible to frame a scheme in which all these various elements might have a place. But such a mode of proceeding would be unsatisfactory, because we have no reason to suppose that Plato intended his scattered thoughts to be collected in a system. There is a common spirit in his writings, and there are certain general principles, such as the opposition of the sensible and intellectual, and the priority of mind, which run through all of them. But he has no definite forms of words in which he consistently expresses himself. While the determinations of human thought are in process of creation, he is necessarily tentative and uncertain, and there is least of definiteness whenever, either in describing the beginning or the end of the world, he has recourse to myths. These are not the fixed modes in which spiritual truths are revealed to him, but the efforts of imagination, by which at different times and in various manners he seeks to embody his conceptions. The clouds of mythology are still resting upon him, and he has not yet pierced to the heaven of the fixed stars which is beyond them. It is safer, then, to admit the inconsistencies of the Timaeus, or to endeavor to fill up what is wanting from our own imagination, inspired by a study of the dialogue, than to refer to other Platonic writings. And still less should we refer to the successors of Plato for the elucidation of it. More light is thrown upon the Timaeus by a comparison of the previous philosophies. For the physical science of the ancients was traditional, descending through many generations of Ionian and Pythagorean philosophers. Plato does not look out upon the heavens and describe what he sees in them, but he builds upon the foundations of others, adding something out of the depths of his own self-consciousness. Socrates had already spoken of God the Creator, who made all things for the best. While he ridiculed the superficial explanations of phenomena which were current in his age, he recognized the marks both of benevolence and of design in the frame of man and in the world. The apparatus of winds and water is contemptuously rejected by him in the Phaedo, but he thinks that there is a power greater than that of any Atlas in the best. Phaedo 97 ff. Compare Aristotle Metaphysics I 4,5. Plato, following his master, affirms this principle of the best, but he acknowledges that the best is limited by the conditions of matter. In the generation before Socrates, Anaxagoras had brought together chaos and mind, and these are connected by Plato in the Timaeus, but in accordance with his own mode of thinking he has interposed between them the idea or pattern according to which mind worked. The circular impulse periosis of the one philosopher answers to the circular movement perichoresis of the other. But unlike Anaxagoras, Plato made the sun and stars living beings and not masses of earth or metal. The Pythagoreans again had framed a world out of numbers, which they constructed into figures. Plato adopted their speculations and improved upon them by a more exact knowledge of geometry. The atomists, too, made the world, if not out of geometrical figures, at least out of different forms of atoms, and these atoms resembled the triangles of Plato in being too small to be visible. But though the physiology of the Timaeus is partly borrowed from them, they are either ignored by Plato or referred to with a secret contempt and dislike. He looks with more favour on the Pythagoreans, whose intervals of number applied to the distance of the planets reappear in the Timaeus. It is probable that among the Pythagoreans living in the 4th century B.C. there were already some who, like Plato, made the earth their centre. Whether he obtained his circles of the same and other from any previous thinker is uncertain. The 4 elements are taken from Empedocles. The interstices of the Timaeus may also be compared with his Porat. The passage of one element into another is common to Heraclitus and several of the Ionian philosophers. So much of a synchronist is Plato, though not after the manner of the Neoplatonists. For the elements which he borrows from others are fused and transformed by his own genius. On the other hand, we find fewer traces in Plato of early Ionic or Eleatic speculation. He does not imagine the world of sense to be made up of opposites or to be in a perpetual flux, but to vary within certain limits which are controlled by what he calls the principle of the same. Unlike the Eleatics, who relegated the world to the sphere of not being, he admits creation to have an existence which is real and even eternal, although dependent on the will of the Creator. 41 A, B. Instead of maintaining the doctrine that the void has a necessary place in the existence of the world, he rather affirms the modern thesis that nature abhors a vacuum. As in the Sophist, he also denies the reality of not being. Compare Aristotle Metaphysics I, 4, 9. But though in these respects he differs from them, he is deeply penetrated by the spirit of their philosophy. He differs from them with reluctance, and gladly recognizes the generous depth of the Parmenides. Theaetetus 183 E. There is a similarity between the Timaeus and the fragments of Philolaus, which by some has been thought to be so great as to create a suspicion that they are derived from it. Philolaus is known to us from the Phaedo of Plato as a Pythagorean philosopher residing at Thebes in the latter half of the 5th century B.C., after the dispersion of the original Pythagorean society. He was the teacher of Timaeus and Cebes, who became disciples of Socrates. We have hardly any other information about him. The story that Plato had purchased 3 books of his writings from a relation is not worth repeating. It is only a fanciful way in which an ancient biographer dresses up the fact that there was supposed to be a resemblance between the 2 writers. Similar gossiping stories are told about the sources of the Republic and the Phaedo. That there really existed in antiquity a work passing under the name of Philolaus, there can be no doubt. Fragments of this work are preserved to us, chiefly in Stobaeus, a few in Boethius, and other writers. They remind us of the Timaeus as well as of the Phaedrus and the Philebus. When the writer says, Stobaeus, Eclogy, I, 22, 7, that all things are either finite, definite, or infinite, indefinite, or a union of the two, and that this antithesis and synthesis pervades all art and nature, we are reminded of the Philebus, 23, ff. When he calls the center of the world Hestia, we have a parallel to the Phaedrus, 247a. His distinction between the world of order, to which the sun and moon and the stars belong, and the world of disorder, which lies in the region between the moon and the earth, approximate to Plato's fear of the same and of the other. Like Plato, Timaeus 62c, ff. He denied the above and below in space, and said that all things were the same in relation to a center. He speaks also of the world as one and indestructible, for neither from within nor from without does it admit of destruction. Compare Timaeus 33. He mentions 10 heavenly bodies, including the sun and moon, the earth and the counter-earth, and Tikthon, and in the midst of them all he places the central fire, around which they are moving. This is hidden from the earth by the counter-earth. Of neither is there any trace in Plato, who makes the earth the center of his system. Philolaus magnifies the virtues of particular numbers, especially the number 10. Stobaeus, Eclogy, I, 2, 3, and descants upon odd and even numbers after the manner of the later Pythagoreans. It is worthy of remark that these mystical fancies are nowhere to be found in the writings of Plato, although the importance of number as a form and also an instrument of thought is ever present to his mind. Both Philolaus and Plato agree in making the world move in certain numerical ratios according to a musical scale, though Boch is of opinion that the two scales of Philolaus and of the Timaeus do not correspond. We appear not to be sufficiently acquainted with the early Pythagoreans to know how far the statements contained in these fragments corresponded with their doctrines, and we therefore cannot pronounce either in favour of the geniuses of the fragments with Boch and Zeller, or with Valentine Rose and Scharschmidt against them. But it is clear that they throw but little light upon the Timaeus, and that their resemblance to it has been exaggerated. That there is a degree of confusion and indistinctness in Plato's account of both man and of the universe has been already acknowledged. We cannot tell, nor could Plato himself have told, where the figure or myth ends and the philosophical truth begins. We cannot explain, nor could Plato himself have explained to us, the relation of the ideas to appearance, of which one is the copy of the other, and yet of all things in the world they are most opposed and unlike. The opposition is presented to us in many forms, as the antithesis of the one and the many, of the finite and infinite, of the intelligible and sensible, of the unchangeable and the changing, of the indivisible and the divisible, of the fixed stars and the planets, of the creative mind and the primeval chaos. These pairs of opposites are so many aspects of the great opposition between ideas and phenomena. They easily pass into one another, and sometimes the two members of the relation differ in kind, sometimes only in degree. As in Aristotle's matter and form, the connection between them is really inseparable, for if we attempt to separate them they become devoid of content, and therefore indistinguishable. There is no difference between the idea of which nothing can be predicted, and the chaos or matter which has no perceptible qualities, between being in the abstract and nothing. Yet we are frequently told that the one class of them is the reality and the other appearance, and one is often spoken of as the double or reflection of the other. For Plato never clearly saw that both elements had an equal place in mind and in nature, and hence, especially when we argue from isolated passages in his writings, or attempt to draw what appear to us to be the natural inferences from them, we are full of perplexity. There is a similar confusion about necessity and free will, and about the state of the soul after death. Also, he sometimes supposes that God is immanent in the world, sometimes that he is transcendent. And having no distinction of objective and subjective, he passes imperceptibly from one to the other, from intelligence to soul, from eternity to time. These contradictions may be softened or concealed by a judicious use of language, but they cannot be wholly got rid of. That an age of intellectual transition must also be one of inconsistency, that the creative is opposed to the critical or defining habit of mind or time, has been often repeated by us. But, as Plato would say, there is no harm in repeating twice or thrice. Laws 6:754c. What is important for the understanding of a great author. It has not, however, been observed that the confusion partly arises out of the elements of opposing philosophies which are preserved in him. He holds these in solution. He brings them into relation with one another, but he does not perfectly harmonize them. They are part of his own mind, and he is incapable of placing himself outside of them and criticizing them. They grow as he grows. They are a kind of composition with which his own philosophy is overlaid. In early life he fancies that he has mastered them, but he is also mastered by them. And in language, compare Sophist 243b, which may be compared with the hesitating tone of the Timaeus, he confesses in his later years that they are full of obscurity to him. He attributes new meanings to the words of Parmenides and Heraclitus, but at times the old Eleatic philosophy appears to go beyond him. Then the world of phenomena disappears, but the doctrine of ideas is also reduced to nothingness. All of them are nearer to one another than they themselves supposed, and nearer to him than he supposed. All of them are antagonistic to sense, and have an affinity to number and measure, and a presentment of ideas. Even in Plato they still retain their contentious or controversial character, which was developed by the growth of dialectic. He is never able to reconcile the first causes of the pre-Socratic philosophers with the final causes of Socrates himself. There is no intelligible account of the relation of numbers to the universal ideas, or of universals to the idea of good. He found them all three in the Pythagorean philosophy and in the teaching of Socrates and of the Megarians respectively, and because they all furnished modes of explaining and arranging phenomena, he is unwilling to give up any of them, though he is unable to unite them in a consistent whole. Lastly, Plato, though an idealist philosopher, is Greek and not Oriental in spirit and feeling. He is no mystic or ascetic. He is not seeking in vain to get rid of matter, or to find absorption in the divine nature, or in the soul of the universe. And therefore we are not surprised to find that his philosophy in the Timaeus returns at last to a worship of the heavens, and that to him, as to other Greeks, nature, though containing a remnant of evil, is still glorious and divine. He takes away or drops the veil of mythology, and presents her to us in what appears to him to be the form fairer and truer far of mathematical figures. It is this element in the Timaeus, no less than its affinity to certain Pythagorean speculations, which gives it a character not wholly in accordance with the other dialogues of Plato. B. The Timaeus contains an assertion perhaps more distinct than is found in any of the other dialogues. Compare Republic 2, 379a, Laws 10, 901, 2. Of the goodness of God. He was good himself, and he fashioned the good everywhere. He was not a jealous God, and therefore he desired that all other things should be equally good. He is the idea of good, who has now become a person, and speaks and is spoken of as God. Yet his personality seems to appear only in the act of creation. In so far as his works, with his eye fixed upon an eternal pattern, he is like the human artificer in the Republic 6, 501b, 10, 597. Here the theory of Platonic ideas intrudes upon us. God, like man, is supposed to have an ideal of which Plato is unable to tell us the origin. He may be said, in the language of modern philosophy, to resolve the divine mind into subject and object. The first work of creation is perfected. The second begins under the direction of inferior ministers. The supreme God is withdrawn from the world and returns to his own accustomed nature. Timaeus 42e. As in the Statesman 272e, he retires to his place of view. So early did the Epicurean doctrine take possession of the Greek mind, and so natural is it to the heart of man, when he has once passed out of the stage of mythology into that of rational religion. For he sees the marks of design in the world, but he no longer sees or fancies that he sees God walking in the garden, or haunting stream or mountain. He feels also that he must put God as far as possible out of the way of evil, and therefore he banishes him from an evil world. Plato is sensible of the difficulty, and he often shows that he is desirous of justifying the ways of God to man. Yet on the other hand, in the 10th book of the Laws, 899, 900, ff., he passes a censure on those who say that the gods have no care of human things. The creation of the world is the impression of order on a previously existing chaos. The formula of Anaxagoras, all things were in chaos or confusion, and then mind came and disposed them, is a summary of the first part of the Timaeus. It is true that of a chaos without differences no idea could be formed. All was not mixed but one, and therefore it was not difficult for the later Platonists to draw inferences by which they were enabled to reconcile the narrative of the Timaeus with the Mosaic account of the creation. Neither when we speak of mind or intelligence do we seem to get much further in our conception than circular motion, which was deemed to be the most perfect. Plato, like Anaxagoras, while commencing his theory of the universe with ideas of mind and of the best, is compelled in the execution of his design to condescend to the crudest physics. C. The morality of the Timaeus is singular, and it is difficult to adjust the balance between the two elements of it. The difficulty which Plato feels is that which all of us feel, and which is increased in our own day by the progress of physical science: how the responsibility of man is to be reconciled with his dependence on natural causes. And sometimes, like other men, he is more impressed by one aspect of human life, sometimes by the other. In the Republic, he represents man as freely choosing his own lot in a state prior to birth, a conception which, if taken literally, would still leave him subject to the dominion of necessity in his afterlife. In the Statesman, he supposes the human race to be preserved in the world only by a divine interposition, while in the Timaeus the supreme God commissions the inferior deities to avert from him all but self-inflicted evils, words which imply that all the evils of men are really self-inflicted. And here, like Plato, 54b, the insertion of a note in the text of an ancient writer is a literary curiosity worthy of remark, we may take occasion to correct an error which occurred at page 408, for there we too hastily said that Plato in the Timaeus regarded all vices and crimes as involuntary. But the fact is that he is inconsistent with himself. In one and the same passage, 86, vice is attributed to the relaxation of the bodily frame, and yet we are exhorted to avoid it and pursue virtue. It is also admitted that good and evil conduct are to be attributed respectively to good and evil laws and institutions. These cannot be given by individuals to themselves, and therefore human actions, in so far as they are dependent upon them, are regarded by Plato as involuntary rather than voluntary. Like other writers on this subject, he is unable to escape from some degree of self-contradiction. He had learned from Socrates that vice is ignorance, and suddenly the doctrine seems to him to be confirmed by observing how much of the good and bad in human character depends on the bodily constitution. So in modern times the speculative doctrine of necessity has often been supported by physical facts. The Timaeus also contains an anticipation of the stoical life according to nature. Man, contemplating the heavens, is to regulate his erring life according to them. He is to partake of the repose of nature and of the order of nature, to bring the variable principle in himself into harmony with the principle of the same. The ethics of the Timaeus may be summed up in the single idea of law. To feel habitually that he is part of the order of the universe is one of the highest ethical motives of which man is capable. Something like this is what Plato means when he speaks of the soul moving about the same in unchanging thought of the same. He does not explain how man is acted upon by the lesser influences of custom or of opinion, or how the commands of the soul watching in the citadel are conveyed to the bodily organs. But this, perhaps, to use once more expressions of his own, is part of another subject, 87b, or may be more suitably discussed on some other occasion, 38b. There is no difficulty, by the help of Aristotle and later writers, in criticizing the Timaeus of Plato, in pointing out the inconsistencies of the work, in dwelling on the ignorance of anatomy displayed by the author, in showing the fancifulness or unmeaningless of some of his reasons. But the Timaeus still remains the greatest effort of the human mind to conceive the world as a whole which the genius of antiquity has bequeathed to us. One more aspect of the Timaeus remains to be considered: the mythological or geographical. Is it not a wonderful thing that a few pages of one of Plato's dialogues have grown into a great legend, not confined to Greece only, but spreading far and wide over the nations of Europe and reaching even to Egypt and Asia? Like the tale of Troy, or the legend of the 10 tribes, compared Ewald, History of Israel, Volume 5, which perhaps originated in a few verses of 2 Esdras, c. 13. It has become famous, because it has coincided with a great historical fact. Like the romance of King Arthur, which has so great a charm, it has found a way over the seas from one country and language to another. It inspired the navigators of the 15th and 16th centuries. It foreshadowed the discovery of America. It realized the fiction so natural to the human mind because it answered the inquiry about the origin of the arts, that there had somewhere existed an ancient primitive civilization. It might find a place wherever men choose to look for it, in north, south, east or west, in the islands of the blessed, before the entrance of the Straits of Gibraltar, in Sweden or in Palestine. It mattered little whether the description in Plato agreed with the locality assigned to it or not. It was a legend so adapted to the human mind that it made a habitation for itself in any country. It was an island in the clouds, which might be seen anywhere by the eye of faith. It was a subject especially congenial to the ponderous industry of certain French and Swedish writers, who delighted in heaping up learning of all sorts, but were incapable of using it. M. Martin has written a valuable dissertation on the opinions entertained respecting the island of Atlantis in ancient and modern times. It is a curious chapter in the history of the human mind. The tale of Atlantis is the fabric of a vision, but it has never ceased to interest mankind. It was variously regarded by the ancients themselves. The stronger heads among them, like Strabo and Longinus, were as little disposed to believe in the truth of it as the modern reader in Gulliver or Robinson Crusoe. On the other hand, there is no kind or degree of absurdity or fancy in which the more foolish writers, both of antiquity and of modern times, have not indulged respecting it. The Neoplatonists, loyal to their master, like some commentators on the Christian scriptures, sought to give an allegorical meaning to what they also believed to be an historical fact. It was as if someone in our own day were to convert the poems of Homer into an allegory of the Christian religion, at the same time maintaining them to be an exact and veritable history. In the Middle Ages the legend seems to have been half forgotten until revived by the discovery of America. It helped to form the Utopia of Sir Thomas More and the New Atlantis of Bacon, although probably neither of these great men were at all imposed upon by the fiction. It was most prolific in the 17th or in the early part of the 18th century, when the human mind, seeking for utopias or inventing them, was glad to escape out of the dullness of the present into the romance of the past or some ideal of the future. The later forms of such narratives contain features taken from the Edda, as well as from the Old and New Testament, also from the tales of missionaries and the experiences of travelers and of colonists. The various opinions respecting the island of Atlantis have no interest for us except in so far as they illustrate the extravagances of which men are capable. But this is a real interest, and a serious lesson, if we remember now as formerly the human mind is liable to be imposed upon by the illusions of the past, which are ever assuming some new form. When we have shaken off the rubbish of ages, there remain one or two questions of which the investigation has a permanent value. 1. Did Plato derive the legend of Atlantis from an Egyptian source? It may be replied that there is no such legend in any writer previous to Plato. Neither in Homer, nor in Pindar, nor in Herodotus is there any mention of an island of Atlantis, nor in any reference to it in Aristotle, nor any citation of an earlier writer by a later one in which it is to be found. Nor have any traces been discovered hitherto in Egyptian monuments of a connection between Greece and Egypt older than the 8th or 9th century B.C. It is true that Proclus, writing in the 5th century after Christ, tells us of stones and columns in Egypt on which the history of the island of Atlantis was engraved. The statement may be false. There are similar tales about columns set up by the Canaanites whom Joshua drove out, Procopius. But even if true, it would only show that the legend, 800 years after the time of Plato, had been transferred to Egypt and inscribed, not, like other forgeries, in books, but on stone. Probably in the Alexandrian age, when Egypt had ceased to have a history and began to appropriate the legends of other nations, many such monuments were to be found of events which had become famous in that or other countries. The oldest witness to the story is said to be Crantor, a Stoic philosopher who lived a generation later than Plato, and therefore may have borrowed it from him. The statement is found in Proclus, but we require better assurance than Proclus can give us before we accept this or any other statement which he makes. Secondly, passing from the external to the internal evidence, we may remark that the story is far more likely to have been invented by Plato than to have been brought by Solon from Egypt. That is another part of his legend which Plato also seeks to impose upon us. The verisimilitude which he has given to the tale is a further reason for suspecting it, for he could easily invent Egyptian or any other tales. Phaedrus 275b. Are not the words, "The truth of the story is a great advantage," if we read between the lines, an indication of the fiction? It is only a legend that Solon went to Egypt, and if he did, he could not have conversed with Egyptian priests or have read records in their temples. The truth is that the introduction is a mosaic work of small touches which, partly by their minuteness and also by their seeming probability, win the confidence of the reader. Who would desire better evidence than that of Critias, who had heard the narrative in youth when the memory is strongest? 26b. At the age of 10 from his grandfather Critias, an old man of 90, who in turn had heard it from Solon himself. Is not the famous expression, "You Hellenes are ever children, and there is no knowledge among you hoary with age," really a compliment to the Athenians who are described in these words as ever young? And is the thought expressed in them to be attributed to the learning of the Egyptian priest, and not rather to the genius of Plato? Or when the Egyptian says, "Hereafter at our leisure we will take up the written documents and examine in detail the exact truth about these things," what is this but a literary trick by which Plato sets off his narrative? Could any war between Athens and the island of Atlantis have really coincided with the struggle between the Greeks and the Persians, as is sufficiently hinted, though not expressly stated, in the narrative of Plato? And whence came the tradition to Egypt? Or in what does the story consist except in the war between the two rival powers and the submersion of both of them? And how was the tale transferred to the poem of Solon? It is not improbable, says Mr. Grote, that Solon did leave an unfinished Egyptian poem. Plato, Vol. 3, page 295. But are probabilities for which there is not a title of evidence, and which are without any parallel, to be deemed worthy of attention by the critic? How came the poem of Solon to disappear in antiquity? Or why did Plato, if the whole narrative was known to him, break off almost at the beginning of it? While therefore admiring the diligence and erudition of M. Martin, we cannot for a moment suppose that the tale was told to Solon by an Egyptian priest, nor can we believe that Solon wrote a poem upon the theme which was thus suggested to him, a poem which disappeared in antiquity, or that the island of Atlantis, or the antediluvian Athens, ever had any existence except in the imagination of Plato. Martin is of the opinion that Plato would have been terrified if he could have foreseen the endless fancies to which his island of Atlantis has given occasion. Rather, he would have been infinitely amused if he could have known that his gift of invention would have deceived M. Martin himself into the belief that the tradition was brought from Egypt by Solon and made the subject of a poem by him. Tome I, page 323. M. Martin may also be gently censured for citing without sufficient discrimination ancient authors having very different degrees of authority and value. 2. It is an interesting and not unimportant question which is touched upon by Martin, whether the Atlantis of Plato in any degree held out a guiding light to the early navigators. He is inclined to think that there is no real connection between them. But surely the discovery of the New World was preceded by a prophetic anticipation of it, which, like the hope of a Messiah, was entering into the hearts of men. And this hope was nursed by ancient tradition, which had found expression from time to time in the celebrated lines of Seneca and in many other places. This tradition was sustained by the great authority of Plato, and therefore the legend of the island of Atlantis, though not closely connected with the voyages of the early navigators, may be truly said to have contributed indirectly to the great discovery. The Timaeus of Plato, like the Protagoras and several portions of the Phaedrus and Republic, was translated by Cicero into Latin. About a fourth, comprehending with lacunae the first portion of the dialogue, is preserved in several MSS. These generally agree, and therefore may be supposed to be derived from a single original. The version is very faithful, and is a remarkable monument of Cicero's skill in managing the difficult and intractable Greek. In his treatise De Natura Deorum 1:8-12, 2:12, he also refers to the Timaeus, which, speaking in the person of Velleius the Epicurean, he severely criticizes. The commentary of Proclus, FL c. 440 A.D., on the Timaeus is a wonderful monument of the silliness and prolixity of the Alexandrian age. It extends to about 30 pages of the book, and is 30 times the length of the original. It is surprising that this voluminous work should have found a translator, Thomas Taylor, a kindred spirit who was himself a Neoplatonist, after the fashion not of the 5th or 16th, but of the 19th century A.D. The commentary is of little or no value, either in a philosophical or philological point of view. The writer is unable to explain particular passages in any precise manner, and he is equally incapable of grasping the whole. He does not take the words in their simple meaning, or sentences in their natural connection. He is thinking, not of the context in Plato, but of the contemporary Pythagorean philosophers and their wordy strife. He finds nothing in the text which he does not bring to it. He is full of Porphyry, Iamblichus, and Plotinus, of misapplied logic, of misunderstood grammar, and of the Orphic theology. Although such a work can contribute little or nothing to the understanding of Plato, it throws an interesting light on the Alexandrian times. It realizes how a philosophy made up of words only may create a deep and widespread enthusiasm, how the forms of logic and rhetoric may usurp the place of reason and truth, how all philosophies grow faded and discolored, and are patched and made up again like worn-out garments, and retain only a second-hand existence. He who would study this degeneracy of philosophy and of the Greek mind in the original cannot do better than devote a few of his days and nights to the commentary of Proclus on the Timaeus. A very different account must be given of the short work entitled Timaeus Locris, which is a brief but clear analysis of the Timaeus of Plato, omitting the introduction or dialogue, and making a few small additions. It does not allude to the original from which it is taken. It is quite free from mysticism and Neoplatonism. In length it does not exceed a 5th part of the Timaeus. It is written in the Doric dialect, and contains several words which do not occur in classical Greek. No other indication of its date, except this uncertain one of language, appears in it. In several places the writer has simplified the language of Plato. In a few others he has embellished and exaggerated it. He generally preserves the thought of the original, but does not copy the words. On the whole, this little tract faithfully reflects the meaning and spirit of the Timaeus. From the garden of the Timaeus, as from the other dialogues of Plato, we may still gather a few flowers and present them at parting to the reader. There is nothing in Plato grander and simpler than the conversation between Solon and the Egyptian priest, in which the youthfulness of Hellas is contrasted with the antiquity of Egypt. Here are to be found the famous words, "O Solon, Solon, you Hellenes are ever young, and there is not an old man among you," which may be compared to the lively saying of Hegel that Greek history began with the youth Achilles and left off with the youth Alexander. The numerous arts of verisimilitude by which Plato insinuates into the mind of the reader the truth of his narrative have been already referred to. Here occur a sentence or two not wanting in Platonic irony, phonanta senestoisi, a word to the wise, 40 D. F.F. To know or tell the origin of the other divinities is beyond us, and we must accept the traditions of the men of old time who affirm themselves to be the offspring of the gods. That is what they say, and they must surely have known their own ancestors. How can we doubt the word of the children of the gods? Although they give no probable or certain proofs, still, as they declare they are speaking of what took place in their own family, we must conform to custom and believe them. 76e. Our creators well knew that women and other animals would some day be framed out of men, and they further knew that many animals would require the use of nails for many purposes. Wherefore they fashioned in men at their first creation the rudiments of nails. Or once more let us reflect on two serious passages in which the order of the world is supposed to find a place in the human soul and to infuse harmony into it. 37a, ff. The soul, when touching anything that has essence, whether dispersed in parts or undivided, is stirred through all her powers to declare the sameness or difference of that thing and some other, and to what individuals are related, and by what affected, and in what way, and how and when, both in the world of generation and in the world of immutable being. And when reason, which works with equal truth, whether she be in the circle of the diverse or of the same, in voiceless silence holding her onward course in the sphere of the self-moved, when reason, I say, is hovering around the sensible world, and when the circle of the diverse, also moving, truly imparts the intimations of sense to the whole soul, then arise opinions and beliefs sure and certain. But when reason is concerned with the rational, and the circle of the same moving smoothly declares it, then intelligence and knowledge are necessarily perfected. Where, proceeding in a similar path of contemplation, he supposes the inward and outer world mutually to imply each other. And 47b. God invented and gave us sight to the end that we might behold the courses of intelligence in the heaven, and apply them to the courses of our own intelligence which are akin to them, the unperturbed to the perturbed, that we, learning them and partaking of the natural truth of reason, might imitate the absolutely unerring courses of God, and regulate our own vagaries. Or let us weigh carefully some other profound thoughts, such as the following, 44c. He who neglects education walks lame to the end of his life, and returns imperfect and good for nothing to the world below. 28c. The Father and Maker of all this universe is past finding out, and even if we found him, to tell of him to all men would be impossible. Or lastly, 29d. Let me tell you then why the Creator made this world of generation. He was good, and the good can never have jealousy of anything. And being free from jealousy, he desired that all things should be as like himself as they could be. This is in the truest sense the origin of creation and of the world, as we shall do well in believing on the testimony of wise men. God desired that all things should be good and nothing bad, so far as this was attainable. This is the leading thought in the Timaeus, just as the idea of good is the leading thought of the Republic, the one expression describing the personal, the other the impersonal good or God, differing in form rather than in substance, and both equally implying to the mind of Plato a divine reality. The slight touch, perhaps ironical, contained in the words, as we shall do well in believing on the testimony of wise men, is very characteristic of Plato. End of Section 8. End of Introduction and Analysis. Recording by Patti Cunningham.